The day my son and his wife moved into the penthouse of my building, she asked me to use the service elevator. "The regular one is for residents," she said, not knowing I owned the entire complex and had designed that penthouse myself. For 3 years I smiled and nodded, playing the role of the helpful mother-in-law while she treated me like hired help. Then one day, when she mockingly asked if I needed a cleaning lady's tip for bringing her groceries, something inside me finally broke. She had no idea that with a single signature, I could have them evicted by morning. But I had a much better plan in mind, one that would teach a lasting lesson about respect, family, and the dangerous mistake of judging someone by appearances. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Westfield Tower's penthouse as I carefully arranged fresh-cut flowers in the crystal vase that had once belonged to my grandmother. Voices drifted from the master bedroom where my son James and his wife Victoria were discussing their upcoming charity gala. I had brought breakfast pastries from the French bakery across town, Victoria's favorite, though she'd never acknowledged this small gesture in the past. "Mother, could you make sure these shirts get to the dry cleaner today?" James emerged from the bedroom, hastily adjusting his tie while holding out 3 designer dress shirts. "The blue one needs to be ready by Thursday for the board meeting." "Of course," I replied, taking the shirts and folding them carefully over my arm. James had always been ambitious, driven. After his father passed away when he was 12, I had raised him alone, pouring everything into ensuring he had every opportunity. Now, at 35, he was a rising executive at a prestigious investment firm, married to Victoria, a former model turned interior designer whose family connections had opened doors that even my considerable resources couldn't have managed. "Eleanor, I need you to pick up my gown from Bellini's before 3, Victoria called out, not bothering to enter the living room where I stood. "And make sure they fixed the beading issue on the left shoulder. Last time they completely botched it." Not Mom or even Eleanor. Just a command, delivered with the casual entitlement of someone addressing household staff. I noted how she never used terms of endearment or relationship when speaking to me, a subtle but persistent reminder of the distance she maintained. "I'll take care of it," I answered, keeping my voice even. Victoria finally emerged, impeccably, dressed in a cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. At 42, I was only 11 years her senior, something she seemed perpetually uncomfortable with, as though my relatively youthful appearance somehow threatened her status. Perhaps that explained why she worked so diligently to position me as the help rather than family. The caterers for Saturday called. "They need to confirm the final head count," she said, scrolling through her phone without looking up. "I told them to speak with you since you're handling all the domestic details." Domestic details. An interesting way to describe the comprehensive event planning I had been doing for their social gatherings for the past 3 years. Before my semi-retirement, I had run Eleanor Reed Events, one of the most successful corporate event planning companies on the East Coast. The business I had built from nothing while raising James alone had coordinated presidential campaign functions and Fortune 100 product launches. Now, I was handling domestic details. "I'll call them right away," I said, placing the vase of flowers on the marble coffee table, the exact spot where architectural plans for this building had been spread out 7 years earlier when I was overseeing its development. "Oh, and don't put those there," Victoria said, finally looking up from her phone. "The table will spot. Use a proper coaster underneath." I moved the vase to the sideboard instead, feeling a familiar tightening in my chest. The irony wasn't lost on me. This penthouse, indeed the entire Westfield Tower, had been my vision, my investment, my creation. The marble coffee table that Victoria was so concerned about? I had selected it personally from a quarry in Italy. The hardwood floors beneath our feet had been hand-finished to my specifications. The smart home technology that controlled everything, from lighting to temperature, had been cutting edge when I had it installed, a point of pride in the building's design. And yet here I stood, being instructed on how to properly care for these items by someone who had no idea of my connection to them. When James had announced his engagement to Victoria 3 years ago, I had been genuinely happy for him. She was beautiful, socially connected, and seemed to make him happy. As a wedding gift, I had offered them the penthouse apartment in Westfield Tower, not revealing that I owned the entire building, merely suggesting that I knew the owner and could arrange a special rate. I had made a conscious decision to keep my wealth and business success low-key around Victoria, wanting her to form a relationship with me based on who I was, not what I owned. It was a decision I had come to regret. "James, darling, don't forget, we're meeting Daddy for lunch at the club," Victoria said as my son returned to the living room, now fully dressed for work. "He wants to discuss the Hampton House options." Right, James nodded, checking his watch. "Mother, there's a package coming today. Some documents from the Tokyo office. Can you make sure to sign for them and put them on my desk? Should arrive around noon." "I'll be here," I assured him, though I had actually planned to meet with my property manager about renovations to the building's lobby this afternoon. I would have to reschedule. Again. After quick air kisses from Victoria and a distracted half-hug from James, they were gone, the heavy door of the penthouse closing behind them with a definitive click. I stood alone in the expansive living room, surrounded by luxury that I had provided but was no longer permitted to claim. 3 years. For 3 years, I had played along with this charade, telling myself it was what James needed. That supporting his marriage meant accepting my diminished role, that Victoria would eventually see me as family rather than staff, that things would change once they had children and needed my help even more. But standing there in the morning light, something shifted inside me, a subtle but seismic realignment of truth. This arrangement wasn't serving anyone, least of all me. James had grown increasingly entitled and unrecognizable from the thoughtful boy I had raised. Victoria remained cold and dismissive, and I had shrunk myself to fit within the narrow confines of their expectations, surrendering my dignity one small concession at a time. I walked to the wall of windows overlooking the city. My city. Below, the morning traffic moved through. Streets I could name without seeing. Past buildings whose histories I knew intimately. In the distance stood the headquarters of Eleanor Reed Events, now run by my former protégé but still bearing my name. Directly below was the private garden I had designed for building residents, where I was not permitted to go without being accompanied by James or Victoria, lest the other residents think I was just a visitor. My phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. "While you're at Bellini's, could you also pick up James's suit from the tailor? And we're out of that special mineral water. The regular delivery person knows which one." "No, please. No, thank you. Not." Even a question mark to suggest it was a request rather than a command. Something crystallized in that moment, a clarity that had been building beneath the surface for months, perhaps years. I was Eleanor Reed. I had built a successful business. From nothing. I had raised a son alone after being widowed at 30. I had created this very building as an investment when everyone said the neighborhood would never support luxury real estate. I owned the floors beneath their feet, the walls around them, the roof over their heads. I had earned every square inch through intelligence, determination, and hard work. And yet, here I was, being treated as an inconvenience, an accessory, a servant. I typed back a simple, "okay," while a plan began forming in my mind. It was time for things to change, not with confrontation or drama, that had never been my style, but with the same strategic thinking that had built my success in the first place. Victoria and James had no idea who they were really dealing with. It was time they learned. As I gathered my purse to head out on Victoria's errands, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. For a moment, I hardly recognized myself. This woman with carefully neutral expressions, accommodating posture, and muted clothing, chosen specifically not to outshine her daughter-in-law. When had I started making myself smaller to fit into the space they had allotted me? Today, I decided, would be the last day of that woman's existence. Eleanor Reed was about to make a comeback. After completing Victoria's errands, the dry cleaning, the designer gown, the imported mineral water, I found myself with an hour to spare before James's package was due to arrive. Instead of returning immediately to the penthouse, I took a small detour entering Westfield Tower through the private entrance I rarely used anymore. "Ms. Reed, what a lovely surprise!" Marcus, the building's head of security, greeted me with genuine warmth. In his 15 years working for me, he had never once treated me with anything less than complete respect. "Hello, Marcus. How's Sophia? Doing with college applications?" I asked, remembering our conversation from my last official visit as the building's owner. His face lit up. "She got into Columbia. That scholarship program you recommended made all the difference." "That's wonderful news," I replied, feeling a rush of pleasure at his family's success. "She's a brilliant girl. They're lucky to have her." "Mrs. Henderson in 14B has been asking when you might stop by again," Marcus continued. "She still talks about how you personally helped her mother get settled when she moved in with them last year." I nodded, making a mental note to visit my longtime tenant. "I'll make a point to see her soon. Is Edward in the management office today?" "Yes, ma'am. He's expecting you." Of course he was. Edward Calloway had been my property manager for all 7 buildings in my real estate portfolio for over a decade. Unlike my son and daughter-in-law, he was well aware of our scheduled meeting. The management office was located on the mezzanine level, deliberately positioned to be accessible yet discreet. The space was designed to reflect the building's overall aesthetic, elegant but not ostentatious, with comfortable seating and soft lighting that put visitors at ease. "Eleanor," Edward greeted me, standing as I entered. "I was beginning to wonder if we'd need to reschedule again." "Not this time," I said, settling into one of the chairs across from his desk. "Though I can only stay for 45 minutes. James is expecting a package." Edward's expression remained neutral, but I recognized the slight tightening around his eyes. Over the past 3 years, he had witnessed my gradual subjugation to James and Victoria's demands, my increasingly contorted schedule to accommodate their needs, my diminishing independence. He had never commented directly, maintaining professional boundaries, but his concern was evident. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I've prepared the reports on the lobby renovation options," he said, sliding a folder across the desk. "The contemporary design would position us competitively against the new development on Riverside, but the classic approach maintains the building's heritage aesthetic. As we discussed the merits of each design, comparing costs and timelines, I felt myself expanding back into the role of property owner and business leader. Here, my opinion wasn't just tolerated but actively sought. My expertise wasn't questioned, but respected. The contrast with how I was treated in the penthouse just 20 floors above was stark and increasingly troubling. "There's another matter we should discuss," Edward said, after we'd settled on a design direction. "Apartment 12C. The lease is coming up for renewal next month." I nodded, familiar with the situation. "The Lawrences. They've been with us for 5 years now. Mr. Lawrence approached me yesterday about potentially breaking their lease. His company is transferring him to their London office. They're hoping to avoid the early termination fee since the move wasn't their choice." The old Eleanor, the one who had been shrinking herself to fit into Victoria's narrow definition of a mother-in-law, would have immediately granted the exception. But as I sat in this office, surrounded by the evidence of my business acumen, I found myself considering the precedent it would set and the building's policies that I had carefully developed over years. Let's offer a compromise, I decided. Reduce the fee by half if they provide at least 60 days' notice and allow us to begin showing the apartment before they vacate. That acknowledges their situation while maintaining our standards. Edward made a note. Fair and reasonable, as always. And let's send them a bottle of champagne to congratulate Mr. Lawrence on his promotion. Include a list of our recommended real estate contacts in London. I believe Thomas Henderson still works, with Savills in Kensington. Consider it done, Edward replied, a small smile playing at his lips. This was the Eleanor Reed he knew. Balancing business necessity with human consideration, firm but generous. As our meeting concluded, I found myself reluctant to return upstairs. The contrast between who I was in this office and who I had become in the penthouse was becoming increasingly untenable. Before I go, I said, I'd like a complete copy of the building's financial records for the past 3 years, along with the tenant roster and any significant maintenance issues. I realize I've been less engaged than usual. Edward nodded, his expression carefully neutral. I'll have everything prepared by tomorrow. Will you be reviewing the other properties as well? Yes, I decided in that moment. All of them. It's time I took a more active role again. The subtle approval in Edward's eyes confirmed what I had begun to realize. My withdrawal from active management of my investments had not gone unnoticed by those who had worked alongside me for years. My attempt to be the mother-in-law Victoria wanted had resulted not just in personal diminishment, but professional neglect. As I rode the elevator back up to the penthouse, I found myself studying my reflection in its mirrored walls. I had unconsciously adopted a wardrobe of muted colors and simple styles that wouldn't draw attention or compete with Victoria's designer outfits. My signature auburn hair, once worn in a distinctive bob that had been something of a trademark in business circles, was now pulled back in a nondescript bun. Even my posture had changed, slightly hunched, taking up less space, physically manifesting my diminished sense of self. When had this transformation occurred? Not overnight, certainly. It had happened in increments so small they were almost imperceptible, agreeing to pick up dry cleaning once, then finding it became my regular responsibility. Offering to help with a dinner party, then becoming the de facto unpaid event coordinator for all their social functions. Accepting Victoria's correction about where to place a vase, then finding myself deferring to her on matters in a home I had designed. The pattern extended beyond household matters. I had stopped mentioning my business experience when Victoria dismissed it as from another era. I had remained silent when James began referring to his financial acumen as something he'd learned despite his upbringing, rather than acknowledging the business education I had made sure he received. I had allowed Victoria to introduce me to her friends as James's mother, without reference to my own identity or accomplishments. Each small concession had seemed reasonable in isolation, minor accommodations to support my son's marriage and maintain family harmony. But collectively, they had eroded not just how others saw me, but how I had come to see myself. The elevator. Doors opened directly into the penthouse foyer, a private entrance that had been a key selling feature when I designed the building. James's package had arrived during my absence and sat on the console table beneath the mirror. I signed the digital pad the courier extended, thanked him, and carried the package to James's home office as requested. As I placed it precisely on the center of his desk, exactly as Victoria would have wanted, my eye caught a framed photograph partially hidden behind a stack of folders. I recognized it immediately. James at his college graduation, his arm around my shoulders, both of us beaming with pride and possibility. I was wearing a vibrant blue dress I had purchased specifically for the occasion, my hair styled in the signature bob, my posture straight and confident. What would that woman think of me now? The woman who had built a successful business while raising a son alone. The woman who had taken calculated risks in real estate investments that paid off magnificently. The woman who had taught James to value hard work, integrity, and treating people with respect regardless of their station. She would be profoundly disappointed. Not in James and Victoria, though their behavior certainly warranted criticism, but in me, in my willingness to be diminished, in my silence in the face of disrespect, in my gradual surrender of the identity I had worked so hard to build. My phone chimed with a text from Victoria. "Don't forget we need those Egyptian cotton sheets changed in the guest room. The Crawfords are staying this weekend." No acknowledgement of the errands I had already completed. No recognition that I might have my own plans or priorities. Just another demand, delivered with the expectation of immediate compliance. As I stared at the message, something shifted inside me. Not a dramatic revelation, but a quiet, powerful certainty. This pattern was not inevitable, it was not unchangeable, and most importantly, it was not acceptable. I was Eleanor Reed, owner of 7 commercial and residential properties across the city, former CEO of a successful event planning business, respected community member, and yes, mother to James. I had allowed the last role to overshadow all. Others, surrendering pieces of myself in a misguided attempt to be the mother-in-law Victoria wanted, rather than the woman I actually was. That ended today. I typed a simple reply to Victoria's text. "I have a meeting this afternoon. The housekeeper can handle the sheets." Then I turned off notifications and slipped my phone into my purse. It was a small step, hardly revolutionary. But as I walked toward the elevator, my posture straightened ever so slightly. My chin lifted a fraction higher. The woman in the mirrored walls looking back at me seemed just a bit more familiar. Glimpse of Eleanor Reed beginning to reemerge from behind the facade of the accommodating mother-in-law I had constructed. The patterns were now visible, and once seen, they could no longer be ignored. Victoria's response to my text came within seconds. "What meeting? You didn't mention any plans. The Crawfords will be here in 2 days." I read the message but didn't reply as I rode the elevator down to the ground floor. The slight tremor in my hand surprised me. A small act of boundary setting shouldn't trigger such physical anxiety. Yet here I was, heart racing slightly as though I'd done something truly rebellious instead of simply declining a household task. "Good afternoon, Ms. Reed," called the doorman as I crossed the marble-floored lobby. "Shall I get you a car?" "No, thank you, Michael. I think I'll walk today." The late September air held the first hints of autumn, crisp and energizing. I had no specific destination in mind, only the need to put physical distance between myself and the penthouse while I processed the realizations of the morning. My feet carried me toward Madison Park, a favorite spot I had once frequented regularly, but had visited less often since becoming absorbed in James and Victoria's lives. My phone buzzed again. Victoria. "Eleanor, we discussed this. The Crawfords are James's potential clients. Everything needs to be perfect." We had discussed no such thing. Victoria had informed me of the Crawfords' visit yesterday, with a comprehensive list of preparations she expected me to handle. There had been no discussion, only directives. I found an empty bench overlooking the small pond and sat, watching a pair of ducks glide across the water. Something about their unhurried movement calmed me. I typed a careful reply. "I've already picked up your gown, James's suit, and the mineral water. The housekeeper can manage the sheets." The response was immediate. "This is extremely inconsiderate. What meeting could possibly be more important than helping your son's career?" The question struck me with its breathtaking entitlement. In Victoria's worldview, any commitment of mine was automatically subordinate to even the most minor need of hers or James's. It was a perspective I had inadvertently reinforced through years of compliance. I put my phone away without responding and turned my attention back to the park. An elderly couple walked hand in hand along the path, leaning slightly toward each other in the comfortable synchrony of long partnership. A young mother guided a toddler's uncertain steps across the grass, her face a mix of patience and pride. A businessman about James's age sat on a nearby bench, phone set aside as he simply watched the ducks, permitting himself a moment of stillness in what was likely an otherwise hectic day. When had I last allowed myself such a moment? When had I last made a choice based solely on my own preferences rather than accommodating someone else's? My watch showed it was nearly 2 o'clock, time for my meeting, which had been fabricated as an excuse, but now struck me as a necessary appointment with myself. I walked to a small cafe at the edge of the park, one I had frequented years ago when my office was nearby. "Ms. Reed," the cafe owner Giuseppe greeted me with genuine delight. "It has been too long. Your usual table?" I was touched that he remembered me after so much time. "That would be lovely, Giuseppe. Thank you." He led me to a corner table with a view of both the park and the street, the perfect vantage point for people watching. Without asking, he brought a cappuccino prepared exactly as I preferred it, with an extra sprinkle of cinnamon. "Still the eye? Same after all these years," he said with a wink as he placed it before me. "The same." The phrase resonated as I wrapped my hands around the warm cup. Was I still the same Eleanor Reed who had been a regular here, rushing in between meetings, often with property reports or event proposals spread across this very table? That woman had been confident, purposeful, respected. She had built things, made decisions, commanded rooms. I took a sip of the cappuccino, allowing the familiar flavor to ground me in the present moment. My phone buzzed again in my purse. I ignored it. "May I bring you something to eat?" Giuseppe asked. "Maria made those almond biscotti you always enjoyed." "Please," I nodded, touched again by his detailed memory. These small recognitions of my preferences and history felt especially meaningful after years of being treated as though my individuality was irrelevant. As I waited for the biscotti, I removed a small notebook from my purse and began to write. The action was instinctive. Throughout my business career, I had processed challenges through writing, clarifying my thoughts and developing strategies on paper before implementing them. It was a practice I had abandoned in recent years. Another piece of myself surrendered to the all-consuming role of James and Victoria's support system. I labeled the page Reclamation and began listing areas of my life that needed attention. 1. Professional identity. 2. Financial management. 3. Social connections. 4. Personal appearance. 5. Living situation. 6. Boundaries with James and Victoria. The last item gave me pause. What exactly did I want from my relationship with my son and his wife? Not this current dynamic, certainly. But complete estrangement wasn't the answer either, despite the momentary satisfaction it might bring to simply walk away from their demands and disrespect. My phone buzzed again, more insistently this time. A call rather than a text. I glanced at the screen. James. I silenced it and returned to my notes. What I wanted, I realized, was a relationship based on mutual respect. One where my identity extended beyond what I could do for them, where my experience and wisdom were valued rather than dismissed, where giving was reciprocal rather than one-sided. How to achieve this transformation without causing irreparable damage to family ties was the challenge. Confrontation would likely trigger defensiveness rather than reflection. Complete withdrawal might satisfy my need for independence, but wouldn't foster the healthier relationship I ultimately desired. I needed a strategy that was both principled and pragmatic. A way to reclaim my identity and rebalance the relationship while leaving space for James and Victoria to adjust their expectations and behavior. As I contemplated this challenge, Giuseppe returned with a small plate of biscotti and refilled my water glass. "It is good to see you writing again," he observed. You were always solving the world's problems at this table. I smiled at his characterization. Just my own today, Giuseppe. Sometimes those are the hardest ones, he replied, with the simple wisdom of someone who had observed human nature across his cafe tables for decades. After he moved on to other customers, I returned to my notebook, this time outlining specific actions for each area needing attention. The process was familiar and comforting. Breaking large challenges into manageable steps had been my approach to business problems for years. By the time I finished my cappuccino, I had developed the framework of a plan. Not a dramatic confrontation, but a steady reclamation of my identity and authority. It would begin with small changes, reinstating regular meetings with my property, managers, reconnecting with former colleagues, refreshing my wardrobe to reflect my true style rather than a deliberately diminished version of myself. These initial steps would lay the groundwork for more significant changes to come, perhaps eventually including a conversation with James about the building's ownership and my broader financial position. But that revelation would come only after I had re-established my own sense of self and created some emotional distance from their approval or reaction. My phone began buzzing again, a series of texts arriving in rapid succession. I finally extracted it from my purse to check. Victoria. This is completely unacceptable. I've had to call the housekeeper myself. James. Mother, what's going on? Victoria says you're refusing to help with the Crawford visit. Victoria again. James is very disappointed in your behavior. The familiar guilt began to rise. The sense that I was failing them, being selfish, not fulfilling my obligations as a mother. For 3 years, this guilt had been my constant companion, the mechanism through which I had been controlled. Today, I recognized it for what it was. A manipulation tool, whether conscious or unconscious on their part. I typed a simple reply to James. Not refusing to help. Already completed several errands this morning. Simply unavailable this afternoon. We'll call later. Then I silenced my phone completely and returned it to my purse. The anxiety remained, but was now accompanied by something else. A quiet sense of accomplishment. I had set a small boundary and maintained it despite pressure. The world hadn't ended. James would survive having his expectations challenged. As I finished my biscotti, I noticed a clothing boutique across the street, Lucia's, an establishment I had frequented years ago. On impulse, I paid my bill, leaving Giuseppe a generous tip for his kind recognition, and crossed the street. Welcome to Lucia's, greeted a young sales associate as I entered. She didn't recognize me as the regular customer I had once been, but that was hardly surprising given the years that had passed. I browsed the rack slowly, allowing myself to be drawn to colors and styles that appealed to me rather than considering how they would appear beside Victoria's designer wardrobe. A vibrant teal blouse caught my eye, a shade I had once favored, for its flattering contrast with my auburn hair and fair skin. Would you like to try that on? The associate asked. Yes, I decided, and perhaps those as well. I indicated a pair of tailored black pants with a subtle pinstripe and a structured blazer in a deep burgundy. In the fitting room, I unbound my hair from its severe bun and shook it loose around my shoulders. The woman in the mirror looked unfamiliar, neither the confident business owner I had once been, nor the self-effacing mother-in-law I had become, but someone in transition between identities. I tried on the teal blouse first. The color brought immediate life to my complexion, making my green eyes appear more vivid. The style was simple but elegant, with a subtle drape that flattered my figure rather than concealing it as my current wardrobe deliberately did. The pants and blazer followed, both fitting remarkably well for off-the-rack items. As I studied my reflection in the three-way mirror, I recognized glimpses of Eleanor Reed re-emerging. Not quite fully restored, but decidedly more present than she had been an hour ago. That color is stunning on you, the associate commented when I emerged. from the fitting room. The whole outfit looks like it was made for you. Thank you, I replied. I'll take all 3 pieces. It was a small act of reclamation, 3 garments that reflected my true taste, rather than a deliberately diminished aesthetic. But as I carried the boutique's distinctive shopping bag back to Westfield Tower, I felt a subtle shift in my energy and presence. In the lobby, Marcus noticed it immediately. "New outfit, Ms. Reed?" he asked with an approving smile. "Just reclaiming a bit of my old style," I replied. As the elevator ascended toward the penthouse, I stood taller, occupying more space physically as I prepared to occupy more space emotionally in the life I had allowed to become so constricted. The woman reflected in the mirrored walls looked more like herself than she had in years, still in transition, still finding her way back, but unmistakably in motion. The silent resistance had begun. The penthouse was silent when I entered, for which I was grateful. James and Victoria were still at their lunch with her father, giving me time to collect myself before the inevitable confrontation. I placed my shopping bag in the guest bedroom where I stayed whenever I spent the night. A room that, like everything else in the penthouse, I had personally designed down to the placement of electrical outlets and the direction the windows faced to catch the morning light. I changed into the teal blouse, leaving the blazer and pants for another day. The simple act of wearing something chosen solely for my own pleasure felt quietly revolutionary. I left my hair loose around my shoulders rather than restoring the severe bun, another small reclamation. As expected, my phone contained several missed calls and increasingly agitated texts. I responded to James with a brief message. "I'm back. At the penthouse now. Your package is on your desk." Within minutes, the elevator announced their return. I could hear Victoria's voice before they even entered the living room. "Completely unreliable lately. I don't understand what's gotten into her." "Mother," James called out. "Are you here?" "In the kitchen," I replied, where I was preparing a pot of tea, a calming ritual I had learned from my grandmother and maintained throughout my life, particularly before difficult conversations. They entered the kitchen with the synchronized stride of a united front, Victoria slightly ahead as usual. Both stopped short when they saw me, their expressions registering surprise before quickly recalibrating. "What are you wearing?" Victoria asked, her tone suggesting she'd discovered me in something wholly inappropriate rather than a simple blouse. "Just something I picked up today," I replied, continuing to arrange the tea service, another family heirloom I had brought to the penthouse. When they moved in, "It's very bright," she said, the word carrying clear disapproval. "I've always favored jewel tones," I responded mildly. "They suit my coloring." James cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with this exchange about my appearance. "Mother, we need to discuss what happened today. Victoria had to call the housekeeper on her day off to come in and prepare the guest room." "That's unfortunate," I said, pouring the steeped tea into 3 cups. "Though I'm sure the overtime pay was appreciated." The comment, mild as it was so uncharacteristic of my usual acquiescence that both James and Victoria stared at me as though I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. "That's not the point," James continued after a moment. "You told Victoria you had a meeting, but you've never mentioned any professional commitments before. What's going on?" I carried the tea tray to the living room, a silent invitation for them to follow. After a moment's hesitation, they did, James taking his usual seat on the sofa while Victoria perched on the edge of an armchair, her posture communicating that she had no intention of staying long. "I've decided to take a more active role in managing my investments again," I said, offering each of them a cup of tea, "starting with regular meetings with my property managers." "Property managers?" Victoria repeated. "What properties are you talking about?" I had never explicitly discussed my financial situation with Victoria, allowing her to form her own assumptions based on my deliberately understated lifestyle. James knew I owned some real estate. He had vague awareness of inheritance from his father, and my own investments, but I had intentionally downplayed the extent of my holdings to encourage his independence. I own several commercial and residential properties in the city, I explained, keeping my tone conversational, including this building. There was a moment of perfect silence as my words registered. Victoria's teacup froze halfway to her lips. James blinked rapidly, as though trying to bring something into focus. "This building?" Victoria finally said. "You mean this apartment?" "No," I clarified gently. "I mean Westfield Tower. The entire building." James set his cup down with excessive care. "Mother, what are you talking about? We have a special arrangement with the owner because you know him." "Her," I corrected. "And yes, I know her quite well." I allowed a small smile. "The building is named after my mother's family. I purchased the land 15 years ago and oversaw its development from architectural planning through construction. It was my second major real estate investment after Eleanor Heights on the west side." Victoria's expression shifted from confusion to calculation so rapidly it was almost comical. James simply looked stunned, as though fundamental laws of the universe had suddenly been rewritten. "Why wouldn't you tell us this?" he asked finally. It was a fair question, one I had anticipated. "When you and Victoria became engaged, I wanted her to form a relationship with me based on who I am, not what I own. I thought keeping my financial situation low-key would foster more genuine connections." "So you've been lying to us," Victoria said, her voice tight. "Not lying," I corrected, maintaining my composure. "Simply not volunteering information about my assets, much as you don't discuss your family's financial situation with me." Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly. It was common knowledge that her family's supposed wealth was largely historical rather than current, old connections but depleted accounts, a situation Victoria carefully obscured through strategic name-dropping and the appearance of affluence. My gentle reference to this reality was not lost on her. "I don't understand," James interjected, clearly struggling to reconcile this new information with his perception of me. "If you own the building, why have you been— you've been running errands and helping with household things like—" He trailed off, unable to complete the comparison that had suddenly become uncomfortable. "Like household staff?" I supplied calmly. "I've been happy to help with many things because I love you and want to support your marriage. But you're right, the dynamic has become increasingly unbalanced." Victoria set her teacup down with a sharp click against the saucer. "I think what James means is that you've been deliberately misleading us about your situation while criticizing how we treat you." "I haven't criticized anyone," I replied. "I'm simply clarifying my position now that I'll be taking a more active role in my business affairs again. My schedule won't permit the same level of availability you've come to expect." The carefully selected word hung in the air between us. Availability. Not servitude, not exploitation, terms that would have escalated the conversation into open conflict, but a neutral description that nevertheless acknowledged the reality of our arrangement. "I see," Victoria said, her tone arctic. "And this sudden decision comes just days before an important business dinner that you knew we were counting on you to help with." "I've already completed several tasks for the Crawford visit," I pointed out. "The groceries have been ordered, your gown picked up, James's suit collected. The housekeeper has handled the guest room. I'm happy to review the dinner arrangements tomorrow, but I have a breakfast meeting with my financial advisor in the morning." James ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that reminded me powerfully of his father. "Mother, this is all very sudden. You've never mentioned property management meetings or financial advisors before." "Because for the past 3 years, I've centered my schedule entirely around your needs," I said gently. "That was my choice, and I don't regret being there for you, but it's time for some recalibration." "Recalibration," Victoria repeated, the word dripping with disdain. Is that what you call dropping a bombshell about secretly owning our home and then announcing you're too busy to help with an important event? I took a measured sip of tea before responding. I don't own your home, Victoria. I gifted this penthouse to James as a wedding present. The deed is in his name. This was another piece of information I had never explicitly shared. James looked startled again. You said we had a special rental arrangement, he said. And you do, I confirmed. You pay no rent because you own it. Or rather, you do. I nodded toward James. It was my gift to you both. Victoria stood abruptly. I need to check on the guest room preparations, she said, clearly needing an excuse to exit the increasingly uncomfortable conversation. After she left, James leaned forward, his voice low. Mother, what's really going on? Are you having financial problems? Is that why you're suddenly concerned about these properties? The question revealed so much about how thoroughly I had obscured my business acumen from my own son. In his mind, the only possible explanation for my renewed interest in my investments was financial distress, not professional engagement or personal fulfillment. No, James. My financial situation is quite secure, I assured him. But managing these assets properly is a responsibility I've neglected while focusing exclusively on supporting you and Victoria. It's time to restore some balance. He studied me with growing awareness, seeing perhaps for the first time in years the woman who had raised him rather than the accommodating mother-in-law I had become. The teal suits you, he said unexpectedly. Reminds me of that dress you used to wear to my school functions. The teachers were always a little intimidated by you. The observation, so personal, so reflective of our shared history, caught me off guard. You remember that? Of course, he nodded. You were always the most capable person in any room. The other kids' parents would come to you with questions instead of the teachers sometimes. He paused, considering me with new eyes. I haven't seen that woman in a while. She's finding her way back, I said softly. James was silent for a moment. The building. Really? I nodded. Really? And Eleanor Heights? Yes. Along with the Riverside Commerce Center, the lakefront apartments, the Gateway Plaza complex, and 2 smaller residential buildings in the University District. He let out a low whistle. I knew you had investments, but I had no idea. He trailed off, then asked, Does Victoria's father know? An interesting question that revealed much about the dynamics between James and his father-in-law. I doubt it. Richard and I travel in different social circles, and I've kept a low profile in real estate development circles since semi-retirement. James nodded slowly, processing this information. He's been helping us look at vacation properties in the Hamptons. Makes a big show of his connections with exclusive listings. I sipped my tea, allowing James to reach his own conclusions about these status displays in light of the new information about my considerably more substantial holdings. The Crawford dinner, he said finally. Will you still? I'll be there, I assured him, and I'm happy to review the arrangements with the caterer tomorrow afternoon. But the hands-on preparation will need to be handled by the staff you employ for that purpose. He accepted this with a nod, more reasonable, now that the initial shock was wearing off. And these meetings you mentioned, they're real? Yes, I confirmed. I'm reconnecting with my property managers, financial advisors, and some former business associates. It's long overdue. Something shifted in James's expression. A flash of the thoughtful boy he had once been before ambition and Victoria's influence had reshaped him. I always knew you were smart, but I think I never really understood what you built, what you accomplished. The simple acknowledgement warmed me more than I had expected. There's time to change that, I offered. If you're interested in learning more about the business side of things, I'd be happy to share. He nodded slowly. I might like that. From the hallway came the sound of Victoria's voice, sharp and irritated as she spoke to someone on the phone, likely complaining about the housekeeper's work or issuing additional instructions for the Crawford visit. The momentary connection between James and me receded as the reality of our current family dynamic reasserted itself. "I should check on Victoria," he said, standing. "Of course," I replied, gathering the tea things. "I'll be in my room if you need me. I have some calls to return." As James left to find his wife, I carried the tea service back to the kitchen, my mind processing what had just occurred. The revelation about the building's ownership had functioned exactly as such catalysts often do, creating seismic disruption in established patterns, forcing new awareness, and revealing the true dynamics at play in our relationships. Victoria's rapid calculation of how this information affected her social and financial positioning. James's genuine surprise, followed by dawning recognition of the disconnection between who I truly was and how he had come to treat me. My own unexpected emotional response to his remembrance of the woman I had been before I diminished myself for their comfort. None of these reactions could have been fully anticipated, yet all were profoundly revealing. The facades we had each maintained were beginning to crack, showing glimpses of more authentic selves beneath the carefully constructed presentations. It wasn't resolution, far from it, but it was revelation. And that, I reflected as I dried. The delicate teacups my grandmother had brought from England decades ago was precisely what was needed to begin the transformation of our family dynamic. The catalyst had done its work. What would emerge from this disruption remained to be seen, but the possibility of something healthier, more balanced, and more authentic now existed, where before there had been only calcified patterns of disrespect and accommodation. For the first time in 3 years, I felt genuinely hopeful about my relationship with my son. And regardless of how Victoria ultimately adjusted to this new reality, I had taken the crucial first step toward reclaiming my own identity and dignity. The woman in the teal blouse was definitely finding her way back. The morning after my revelation about Westfield Tower, I dressed with deliberate care for my breakfast meeting with Diane Lambert, my longtime financial advisor. The new burgundy blazer paired perfectly with the black pinstriped pants and a cream silk shell. As I fastened my grandmother's pearl earrings, jewelry I had stopped wearing because Victoria once commented they looked dated, I studied my reflection with growing recognition. The woman in the mirror was no longer a stranger, nor was she entirely the Eleanor Reed of 3 years ago. She was someone new yet familiar, a synthesis of who I had been and who I was becoming. The penthouse was quiet as I gathered my portfolio and purse. Victoria and James were typically late risers, a schedule I had adjusted to over the years, arriving early to prepare coffee and breakfast before they emerged. Today, I moved quietly through the kitchen, making only enough coffee for myself in a travel mug. The small act of prioritizing my own schedule felt significant. As I waited for the elevator, the master bedroom door opened and James appeared, dressed in running clothes rather than his usual business attire. "You're up early," I observed, surprised. "Thought I'd get a run-in before work," he replied, then gestured to my outfit. "You look nice, very professional." "Thank you," I said, touched by the simple acknowledgement. "I have that breakfast meeting," I mentioned. He nodded, a hint of awkwardness lingering between us after yesterday's revelations. "With your financial advisor, right?" "Yes, Diane Lambert. She's been handling my investment portfolio for nearly 20 years. "The name sounds familiar," James said, his brow furrowing slightly. "She spoke at your business school's Women in Finance seminar. You were a sophomore, I believe." Recognition dawned. "Dr. Lambert? With the white streak in her hair? She was brilliant. I had no idea she was your advisor." "There's quite a lot about my professional life you haven't known," I said, keeping my tone gentle rather than accusatory. "That's on me for compartmentalizing so completely." The elevator arrived with its characteristic soft chime. "Maybe we could have dinner sometime," James suggested unexpectedly. Just the two of us. You could fill me in on everything I've missed. The offer, tentative as it was, represented the first time in years that James had initiated spending time with me outside of family obligations or requests for assistance. It felt like a fragile tendril of new growth emerging from previously barren ground. "I'd like that," I said simply. As the elevator doors closed between us, I saw something shift in James's expression, a mixture of regret and realization that suggested he was beginning to see the distance that had developed between us and perhaps felt its loss more acutely than I had realized. The restaurant where I was meeting Diane was a 15-minute walk from Westfield Tower, an upscale establishment that catered to the business community with discreet service and well-spaced tables that allowed for confidential conversations. As I approached the entrance, I spotted a familiar figure already seated on the patio. "Eleanor Reed," called a warm voice, "as I live and breathe." Catherine Zhao rose from her table, arms outstretched in greeting. We had been friendly competitors in the event planning industry for over a decade before becoming genuine friends after I sold my company. She had recently retired herself, passing her business to her daughter, much as I had transitioned mine to my protégé. "Catherine," I embraced her, genuinely delighted. "How wonderful to see you. Are you joining Diane and me for breakfast?" "Diane's running 10 minutes late. Some client emergency. She called the restaurant and they relayed the message when I arrived." Catherine gestured to the chair across from her. "I hope you don't mind my company in the meantime. I was meeting my daughter here later, but I can certainly give you privacy when Diane arrives." "Don't be ridiculous," I said, settling into the offered chair. "It's been far too long since we've caught up properly." A server appeared immediately with coffee, suggesting Catherine had already arranged for it, remembering my preference for a particular medium roast with a touch of cinnamon. "Look at you," Catherine said approvingly once the server departed. "The Eleanor Reed I remember has finally made a reappearance. That blazer is exactly your style." The observation, so similar to Giuseppe's comment yesterday about being still the same, struck a chord. Catherine had known me at the height of my career, when my identity as a successful businesswoman was firmly established and my personal style reflected that confidence. "I've been subdued. For a while," I admitted. Catherine's shrewd eyes assessed me over the rim of her coffee cup. "I noticed, the few times I've seen you in recent years, you've seemed diminished somehow. I assumed it was grief over David, but it persisted long past what seemed normal for mourning." The directness was pure Catherine. No artifice, no delicate sidestepping of difficult topics. It was refreshing after years of Victoria's passive-aggressive communications and James's increasing emotional distance. "Not grief," I clarified. "At least not entirely. More a voluntary surrender of identity that I'm only now recognizing for what it was." "Ah," Catherine nodded with immediate understanding. "Your son's marriage. The elegant ice princess with the family connections." I raised an eyebrow. "You've met Victoria at the Halston Foundation Gala last year. You were there as well, though I barely recognized you. Hair pulled back severely, wearing that colorless shift dress that did nothing for your complexion, standing quietly behind Victoria as she held court with the board members." I winced at the accurate description. I was trying to be supportive. "You were trying to be invisible," Catherine corrected, not unkindly, "and succeeding rather too well. I almost came over, but you seemed so deliberately removed from the proceedings that I wasn't certain my approach would be welcome." The observation stung with its accuracy. I had indeed cultivated a kind of invisibility in Victoria's social circles, believing it would make her more comfortable with my presence. In reality, it had only reinforced the servant-like role I had unconsciously adopted. "Things are changing," I said firmly, starting with reclaiming my professional identity. "Hence the meeting with Diane," Catherine nodded. "Good. Your financial Acumen was always exceptional. The city's real estate landscape has missed your influence. Before I could respond, Diane herself appeared, her distinctive white streak standing out dramatically against her otherwise dark hair. At 62, she moved with the brisk energy of someone half her age, turning heads not through conventional beauty, but through sheer force of presence. "Eleanor, my apologies for the delay," she said, setting her briefcase on an empty chair. "Catherine, wonderful to see you. Will you be joining us?" "I'll leave you to your business," Catherine said, rising. "But Eleanor, we should reconnect properly. My daughter and I are hosting a small gathering next week, just women from our industry days. Several have asked about you. Would you consider joining us?" The invitation represented exactly the kind of professional reconnection I had determined to pursue. "I'd be delighted. Send me the details." After Catherine departed with promises to be in touch, Diane opened her briefcase and extracted a sleek tablet. "Now then, shall we review your portfolio? I've prepared a comprehensive overview as you requested, with particular attention to the commercial properties." For the next hour, we immersed ourselves in financial projections, occupancy rates, maintenance schedules, and market analyses. The language of business, precise, objective, data-driven, felt like returning to my native tongue after years of speaking only the diluted dialect of domestic concerns and social niceties. "The Riverside Commerce Center is significantly outperforming projections," Diane noted, sliding a graph across the table. "Your decision to renovate last year and incorporate green technology has positioned it perfectly for the current market." "The tax incentives didn't hurt either," I observed, studying the numbers with satisfaction. "Always 3 steps ahead." Diane smiled approvingly. "That's the Eleanor Reed I've missed in our quarterly reviews. For a while there, I was concerned you'd lost interest in the business aspects entirely." "Not lost interest," I corrected, "just temporarily diverted." "Well, I'm glad to have your full attention back. There's an opportunity I've been holding for you, a mixed-use development site near the university that's coming available next quarter. It would pair beautifully with your existing properties in that area." We spent another 30 minutes discussing the potential acquisition, my mind fully engaged with the strategic considerations and financial projections. By the time we concluded our meeting, I felt more intellectually stimulated than I had in months, possibly years. "One last thing," Diane said as we prepared to leave. "I ran into Richard Prescott at the Economic Forum last month. He mentioned his daughter's husband was looking at vacation properties through his connections. The name didn't register until you called to schedule this meeting." Richard Prescott was Victoria's father, a man who cultivated an air of significant wealth and influence that didn't entirely align with his actual financial position, a situation Victoria had carefully obscured from James. James mentioned they were exploring options in the Hamptons, I confirmed neutrally. Diane's expression remained professionally composed, but I detected a hint of concern. "Eleanor, you know I'm bound by client confidentiality, so I can only speak in generalities. But as someone who has managed your assets for 2 decades, I would strongly advise caution regarding any financial entanglements with the Prescott family." The warning was delivered with careful discretion, but was clear nonetheless. Victoria's family financial situation was apparently more precarious than their social positioning suggested, information that added interesting context to Victoria's rapid reassessment of me after learning about my property ownership. "I appreciate your professional guidance, as always," I replied with equal discretion. As we parted outside the restaurant, Diane grasped my hands warmly. "It's good to have you back, Eleanor. Don't be a stranger again." Walking back toward Westfield Tower, I reflected on the breakfast meeting with a sense of growing clarity. In Catherine and Diane, I had been reminded of relationships founded on mutual respect and genuine recognition of my capabilities. Their easy acknowledgement of my professional identity and accomplishments stood in stark contrast to how I was viewed and treated within my son's household. These were the connections I needed to nurture, relationships that reflected and reinforced my authentic self rather than diminishing it. Not to replace family bonds, but to provide the balanced perspective that would help me recalibrate those bonds on healthier terms. Near the entrance to Westfield Tower, I encountered Mrs. Henderson from apartment 14B, whom Marcus had mentioned was asking after me. In her mid-70s, Frances Henderson had been one of the building's first residents and had served on the Tenants Association board since its formation. "Eleanor!" she exclaimed, reaching for my hands much as Diane had done. "I was beginning to think you'd abandoned us entirely to that management company. Marcus said you were in the building yesterday, but by the time I came down, you'd gone." "Frances, it's wonderful to see you," I replied warmly. "How is your mother settling in?" "Beautifully, thanks to your help with the accessibility modifications. Having her with us has been such a blessing." She studied me appraisingly. "You look more like yourself today. For a while there, whenever I saw you coming or going from the penthouse, you seemed faded somehow." The observation, coming, from someone who knew me only as the building's owner, rather than as James's mother, carried particular weight. Even residents who had no personal connection to me had noticed the change in my demeanor and presentation over the past 3 years. "I'm finding my way back," I said, echoing what I had told James the day before. "Good," Frances nodded firmly. "The building association has missed your input. Edward does his best, but he's not you. Will you be attending the quarterly meeting next month? There are several proposals regarding the lobby renovation that would benefit from your perspective." "I wouldn't miss it," I promised, realizing as I spoke that I had indeed missed the previous several meetings, allowing Edward to represent my interests rather than participating directly. As Frances continued toward the park and I entered the building lobby, I felt a growing sense of reconnection, not just with individuals, but with the identity I had allowed to atrophy. Catherine, Diane, Frances, each interaction had reinforced aspects of myself that had nothing to do with being James's mother or Victoria's mother-in-law. Each woman had recognized and responded to me as Eleanor Reed, business owner, property developer, community member, friend. These were my unexpected allies in the reclamation project I had begun, people who knew who I truly was and welcomed the reemergence of that authentic self. Their natural recognition and respect created a powerful counterbalance to the diminished role I had accepted in my son's household. As I rode the elevator toward the penthouse, I stood taller, more fully present in my own skin than I had been in years. Whatever awaited me upon my return, Victoria's cold disdain, James's conflicted reassessment, or some new dynamic altogether, I would face it not as the accommodating shadow I had become, but as Eleanor Reed in full. The unexpected. Allies had reminded me who I was. Now it was time to ensure that everyone else remembered too. The penthouse was not empty when I returned from my breakfast meeting. Victoria sat at the dining table surrounded by fabric swatches, floral arrangement sketches, and menu options, the Crawford dinner preparation in full swing. She glanced up as I entered, her gaze taking in my professional attire with a flash of something that might have been surprise, before her expression smoothed into practiced neutrality. "Your meeting went well?" she asked, the polite inquiry, so uncharacteristic that I nearly stopped mid-stride. "Very productive," I replied, setting my portfolio on the sideboard. Diane had excellent insights on some potential new investments. Victoria nodded, returning her attention to the papers before her. "The caterer called. They're suggesting a change to the fish course since Chilean sea bass isn't available. I wasn't sure what to tell them." The statement contained an implicit question: would I handle this problem as I typically had in the past? The old Eleanor would have immediately picked up the phone, drawing on her event planning expertise to resolve the menu crisis. The emerging Eleanor recognized this as an opportunity to establish new patterns. What are they proposing instead? I asked, taking a seat across from her rather than immediately springing into action. Black cod with miso glaze. I'm not familiar with it. It's an excellent substitute. Delicate flavor, beautiful presentation. I've used it for events when sea bass wasn't available. I provided the information, but made no move to take over the decision or communication. Victoria studied me for a moment, clearly waiting for me to offer more assistance. When I didn't, she asked directly, "Would you mind calling them back? You know more about these things than I do." The acknowledgement of my expertise was new, a subtle shift in our dynamic following yesterday's revelations. I considered my response carefully, balancing boundary setting with reasonable cooperation. "I'd be happy to give my opinion on menu options," I said. "But since it's your event, you should make the final decisions and communicate them to the vendors. That ensures they recognize you as the client rather than deferring to me." Victoria's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose slightly at this unexpected response. For 3 years, I had functioned as her unofficial event coordinator without acknowledgement or compensation, handling all vendor communications and logistical details, while she claimed credit for the flawless execution. "I see," she said after a moment. "And the floral arrangements? I'm torn between the white orchids and the mixed garden arrangement." "Both would work beautifully with your dining room," I observed. "Which speaks more to the impression you want to create for the Crawfords?" Again, I provided perspective without taking responsibility for the decision. It was a subtle but significant shift, from doing for her to advising when asked, maintaining the boundaries I had determined to establish. Victoria seemed to realize this was the most assistance I would offer. She straightened slightly, reassessing our interaction. "The mixed arrangement feels more welcoming, I think. Less formal." "That aligns well with a dinner focused on relationship building rather than pure impression management," I agreed. She made a notation on her planning sheet, then looked up with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. "James mentioned you two might have dinner, just the two of you." The statement carried complex undertones: curiosity, territoriality, perhaps concern about what might be discussed in her absence. I responded simply, "Yes. He suggested it this morning. We haven't set a date yet." He was quite impacted by what you shared yesterday. I nodded, acknowledging this reality without apology. It's natural to be surprised when you discover new information about someone you thought you knew completely. Victoria's gaze sharpened at this observation, perhaps detecting the broader application beyond just my revelation about property ownership. Our entire relationship had been built on incomplete information, my deliberately understated presentation, of myself and her carefully maintained facade of old money privilege. "Yes," she agreed after a moment. "Surprises can be illuminating." The tension in the air was palpable but not entirely negative, more a recalibration of mutual awareness than outright hostility. We were reassessing each other with new information, adjusting our understanding and approach accordingly. My phone chimed with a message from Edward about a maintenance issue in the building's garage. "Excuse me," I said, standing. "I need to handle this." Victoria nodded, returning to her event planning with a slightly different energy than before. Less entitled command, more focused self-reliance. It was a small shift, but precisely the kind of recalibration I had hoped to achieve through my changed behavior. In my room, I responded to Edward's message, then changed from my business attire into more casual clothes for an appointment I had scheduled without telling James or Victoria. A meeting with a real estate agent to view available apartments in the city. The decision to potentially move out of the penthouse's guest room had crystallized during my breakfast with Diane. While I had no intention of disappearing from James's life, establishing physical as well as emotional independence seemed increasingly necessary for a healthy recalibration of our relationship. As I prepared to leave, I stood for a moment at the window overlooking the city. The view was spectacular, I had designed the penthouse with precisely these sightlines in mind, but the beauty had been diminished by the growing discomfort of my position within these walls. No matter how luxurious the surroundings, a space where one feels consistently diminished can never truly feel like home. I informed Victoria I would be out for several hours but would return in time to review the final dinner arrangements as promised. She acknowledged this with a nod, absorbed in a phone call with the florist. The ease with which she adapted to handling these details herself confirmed my suspicion that her dependence on me had been more convenient than necessary. The real estate agent, Sophia Chen, met me in the lobby of a renovated pre-war building 20 minutes from Westfield Tower. I had selected her specifically because she had no connection to my own real estate circles, ensuring discretion about my potential relocation. "Ms. Reed, it's a pleasure to meet you," she greeted me professionally. "Based on your preferences, I've selected 3 properties to show you today, beginning with this building. The available unit is on the 8th floor, not a penthouse, but with excellent southern exposure and recently updated amenities. The apartment was lovely, spacious without being excessive, with the character and craftsmanship typical of buildings from that architectural era. I could envision my furniture in the rooms. Imagine morning coffee on the small balcony overlooking a tree-lined street. Picture evenings spent in the reading nook created by a bay window. The building has an interesting history," Sophia explained as we toured. "It was originally constructed in 1928 as luxury residences, then converted to offices during the business boom of the 1950s, and finally restored to residential use in the early 2000s. Many of the original architectural details were preserved during the renovation." I ran my hand along the crown molding in the living room, appreciating the craftsmanship. "Who handled the conversion back to residential?" "Hamilton Restoration Group," Sophia replied. "They're known for their historically sensitive adaptations." I nodded with approval. "They do excellent work. I hired them for the lakefront apartments renovation several years ago." Sophia's expression flickered with momentary surprise before her professional demeanor reasserted itself. "You've worked with them directly?" "Yes, on several projects," I confirmed, choosing not to elaborate further on my real estate development background. Today, I was here as a potential tenant, not as a fellow developer. The second property was in a newer building, sleek, modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows and an open-concept layout. While beautifully designed, it lacked the character and warmth I preferred in a home. The third option, a charming brownstone with a private garden, came closest to what I envisioned for this next chapter of my life. "The owner is only interested in a long-term tenant," Sophia explained as we walked through the garden's wrought iron gate. "She's relocating to France for at least 5 years and wants someone who will care for the property as she has." The brownstone's interior was a perfect blend of traditional architecture and thoughtful modern updates. Original hardwood floors and fireplace mantels alongside a renovated kitchen with state-of-the-art appliances. The master suite occupied the entire top floor, with a sitting area that could easily serve as a home office. "The garden is the crown jewel," Sophia said as we stepped outside again. "Completely redesigned 3 years ago by Eliza Morrison." I recognized the landscape architect's name immediately. She had consulted on the Westfield Tower's resident garden. The connection felt serendipitous, as though the pieces of my independent life were aligning even as I contemplated this significant change. "It's perfect," I said quietly, more to myself than to Sophia. "Shall I prepare an application?" she asked, professional but clearly pleased by my response to the property. I hesitated only briefly. Yes, I'd like to move forward. The decision felt momentous, yet entirely right. My first concrete step toward reestablishing an independent life beyond my role in James and Victoria's world. I would still be close enough to maintain a relationship with my son, still available for genuinely important family moments, but no longer living in their space on their terms. As Sophia and I discussed the lease details, I experienced both anxiety and exhilaration, the natural response to deliberately stepping into discomfort for the sake of growth. The familiar temptation to retreat into security and accommodation flickered briefly before extinguishing against my strengthening resolve. The owner would like the tenant to meet her before finalizing the agreement, Sophia explained as we concluded our discussion. She's quite attached to the home and wants to ensure it will be in good hands. Would you be available tomorrow afternoon? Yes, I confirmed. I'll adjust my schedule. The phrase itself represented a meaningful shift. I would adjust my schedule rather than automatically prioritizing James and Victoria's needs. Small semantics, perhaps, but indicative of a larger internal realignment. Returning to Westfield Tower after the property viewings, I felt a curious mixture of emotions. Excitement about the brownstone's possibilities alongside a poignant awareness that I was preparing to leave the building I had created. This structure had been one of my proudest professional accomplishments, yet my connection to it had become complicated by the dynamics with James and Victoria. Perhaps some distance would restore the pride without the discomfort. Perhaps overseeing it as an owner rather than inhabiting it as an increasingly marginalized family member would re-establish a healthier relationship with both the property and the people who lived in its most prestigious apartment. In the penthouse, I found Victoria still at the dining table, now focused on place cards and seating arrangements. She looked up as I entered, her expression questioning. "I've been apartment hunting," I said directly, choosing transparency over evasion. The deliberate discomfort of this conversation was necessary for genuine change. Victoria set down her pen, giving me her full attention. "You're moving out?" "I'm exploring options," I clarified. "I've found a beautiful brownstone that might be perfect." She was silent for a moment, processing this unexpected development. When she finally responded, her question surprised me. "Is this because of how we've treated you?" The directness was uncharacteristic of Victoria, who typically employed more oblique communication strategies. Perhaps yesterday's revelations had inspired a reassessment of her own approach as well as mine. "It's because it's time for me to reestablish my own space," I replied honestly. "For all of us, living in such close proximity has created patterns that aren't serving anyone particularly well." Victoria nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful rather than defensive. "James will be upset." "Perhaps, initially," I acknowledged. "But having his mother in the guest room at 42 isn't ideal for anyone, including James. This isn't about distance, Victoria. It's about appropriate boundaries." "Boundaries," she repeated, considering the word. "Yes, I suppose those have been rather blurred." It was the closest she had come to acknowledging the imbalance in our relationship. Not quite an apology, but a recognition that something had been amiss in our dynamic. I accepted it as the beginning of a potentially more honest interaction between us. "I'll still be available to help with important events," I assured her. "Including Saturday's dinner. I've promised to review the arrangements tomorrow afternoon, but day-to-day household management will need to shift to you and the staff you employ." Victoria's lips curved in what might have been a rueful smile. "I suppose I've grown rather accustomed to your expertise always being available on demand." "Most people would have to pay handsomely for an event planner with my experience," I observed mildly. "You've had those services on call for 3 years." For the first time in our relationship, Victoria laughed. A genuine sound without the usual social performance quality. "When you put it that way, I've been getting quite a bargain." The moment of authentic connection, however brief, suggested possibilities I hadn't previously considered. Perhaps Victoria and I would never be close in the traditional mother-in-law or daughter-in-law sense, but we might establish a relationship based on mutual respect and clearly defined boundaries rather than unspoken expectations and unexpressed resentments. I excused myself to make some calls related to the brownstone application, feeling a lightness that had been absent for months, possibly years. The deliberate step into discomfort, choosing potential conflict over continued accommodation, had already yielded unexpected benefits in the form of more honest communication. As I contacted references for the lease application, I reflected on how quickly momentum builds once the first difficult step is taken. 24 hours ago, I had still been the accommodating, diminished version of myself that had evolved over 3 years of prioritizing James and Victoria's needs above my own. Now, I was actively pursuing independent living arrangements, reconnecting with professional contacts, and establishing boundaries that would allow for healthier relationships with both my son and daughter-in-law. The discomfort was real. Change always brings uncertainty, and challenging established patterns inevitably creates friction. But with each deliberate step into that discomfort, I was reclaiming both my identity and my dignity in ways that would ultimately benefit not just me but my relationships with those I cared about most. Eleanor Reed was indeed finding her way back, not by dramatic confrontation, but through steady, deliberate choices to honor her own worth alongside her love for her family. The path forward would undoubtedly hold further challenges, but I was increasingly confident in my capacity to navigate them with integrity and purpose. The woman who had once designed this entire building was more than capable of designing this next chapter of her life. The Crawford dinner arrived on Saturday evening with perfect autumn weather, cool enough for elegant outerwear, but not so cold that guests would be uncomfortable transitioning from cars to the building entrance. I had spent Friday afternoon reviewing Victoria's arrangements as promised, offering targeted suggestions rather than taking control of the event. To my surprise, she had implemented most of my recommendations without resistance, even expressing appreciation for my expertise in wine pairings and service timing. James had been less directly engaged with the dinner preparations, but had sought me out Friday evening for a brief, surprisingly earnest conversation. "Mother, about the apartment hunting," he'd begun, clearly uncomfortable but determined. "Victoria mentioned you found a place you like." "A brownstone with a lovely garden," I confirmed. "If all goes well with the meeting tomorrow, I'll likely sign the lease next week." He had nodded slowly, absorbing this information. "I want you to know this isn't what I want. You're always welcome here." The sentiment was touching even if it failed to acknowledge the reality of our situation. "I know, James, but it's time for me to re-establish my own space. You and Victoria need privacy as you build your life together, and I need an environment where I can fully be myself." "Has it been that bad?" he'd asked, genuine concern in his expression. "Living here with us?" I had considered my response carefully, balancing honesty with kindness. "It hasn't been bad, James, but it hasn't been healthy for any of us. The patterns we've fallen into don't bring out the best in you or Victoria, and they've required me to become someone I don't particularly recognize or respect." He had winced at that, recognition flickering across his features. "I never meant for that to happen." "I know," I had assured him. "And that's precisely why creating some healthy distance now is the right choice. I'm not disappearing from your life. I'm simply adjusting how I participate in it." Now, as I dressed for the Crawford dinner in my own bedroom, I reflected on that conversation with cautious optimism. James was beginning to see me more clearly, not just as his mother but as an individual with legitimate needs and boundaries. The process wasn't complete, but momentum was building in a positive direction. I selected a deep emerald dress I hadn't worn in years, a piece Victoria had once dismissed as too bold for a family gathering. The color flattered my complexion and hair, while the classic cut was sophisticated without trying to compete with Victoria's inevitably more trendy ensemble. I paired it with my grandmother's pearls and subtle gold earrings, completing the look with light makeup that enhanced rather than masked my features. The woman in the mirror looked polished, confident, and age-appropriate, neither trying to appear younger than her years nor surrendering to the invisibility often expected of women past a certain age. She looked, I realized with satisfaction, exactly like Eleanor Reed. When I emerged from my room, James was adjusting his tie in the hallway mirror. He turned as he heard my door, his expression shifting to one of pleasant surprise. "You look beautiful, Mother," he said with genuine appreciation. "That color is stunning on you." "Thank you," I replied, accepting the compliment without deflection or minimization, another small reclamation of my authentic self. Victoria appeared from the master suite in a sleek navy sheath dress, her own preparations complete. She paused briefly upon seeing me, taking in my appearance with an assessing gaze that held none of her usual subtle disapproval. "The emerald suits you perfectly," she said after a moment. "Very elegant." Coming from Victoria, whose observations about my appearance had typically served to reinforce my subordinate position in her household, the straightforward compliment represented a noteworthy shift in our dynamic. I acknowledged it with a simple, "Thank you," and moved toward the living room to ensure the bar was properly set up for pre-dinner cocktails. The Crawfords arrived precisely at 7, the husband a distinguished-looking man in his early 50s with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to wealth and influence. The wife, a stylish blonde whose warmth seemed genuine rather than performative. 2 other couples completed the guest list: the Winthrops, longtime friends of Victoria's family, and the Chandlers, associates of James from his firm. As Victoria made introductions, I noticed something interesting. Where previously she would have presented me simply as James's mother, with no further context, tonight she added, "Eleanor Reed, who built her own highly successful event planning business before moving into real estate development." The brief addition of my professional background, while far from a complete representation of my accomplishments, nonetheless acknowledged dimensions of my identity beyond my maternal relationship to James. It was a small but meaningful gesture that suggested Victoria was reconsidering how she positioned me in her social circles. Throughout the cocktail hour, I participated in conversations as a fully engaged adult rather than hovering at the periphery or slipping into the kitchen to check on dinner preparations. When Mrs. Crawford mentioned an interest in historic architecture, I shared insights about the pre-war buildings in my real estate portfolio. When Mr. Winthrop brought up changes in the city's business district, I contributed perspectives from my years of commercial property management. The momentum of my personal reclamation continued to build as I found myself naturally occupying more space, physically, verbally, energetically, than I had in similar gatherings over the past 3 years. The responses from the guests confirmed what I had begun to recognize. People found the authentic Eleanor Reed far more engaging than the diminished version I had allowed myself to become. As we moved to the dining room for dinner, I caught James watching me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret, something between admiration and realization, as though seeing a familiar painting suddenly illuminated by better lighting. The dinner itself progressed beautifully, Victoria's careful planning and my strategic suggestions resulting in a seamless experience for the guests. The conversation flowed easily, the food was excellent, and the overall atmosphere achieved precisely the blend of elegance and warmth Victoria had hoped to create for the Crawfords. During dessert, Mr. Crawford turned to me with genuine interest. "Victoria mentioned you developed this building. That's impressive. Westfield Tower has quite a reputation for quality and thoughtful design." Before I could respond, Mrs. Chandler joined the conversation. "Wait, you're that Eleanor Reed? The one behind Eleanor Heights and the Riverside Commerce Center as well?" I acknowledged this with a modest nod. Yes, though the Riverside project was a collaborative effort with several talented architects and engineers. My sister leased commercial space in the Riverside building last year, Mrs. Chandler continued enthusiastically. She can't say enough good things about how well it's managed. The attention to detail is remarkable. Eleanor insists on regular maintenance reviews and tenant satisfaction surveys for all her properties, James contributed unexpectedly. It's why her buildings maintain their value so well, even in fluctuating markets. I glanced at James, surprised by both his knowledge of my management practices and his evident pride in sharing this information. He met my gaze with a small smile that suggested he had been paying more attention to my business activities over the years than I had realized. Real estate development is typically such a male-dominated field, Mrs. Crawford observed. It must have been challenging to establish yourself in that environment. There were certainly obstacles, I acknowledged, but I found that focusing on quality, sustainability, and tenant experience created a distinctive approach that differentiated my projects from competitors, regardless of gender. Eleanor built her event planning business the same way, Victoria added, again surprising me with her knowledge of my professional history. Quality and client experience above all else. It's still considered one of the top firms in the city years after she sold it. The conversation continued along these lines, with genuine interest in my business background from the guests, and unexpected recognition of my accomplishments from both James and Victoria. What might once have been an evening of supporting from the shadows had transformed into an experience of being fully present and acknowledged as a successful professional in my own right. As the evening wound down and guests prepared to depart, Mr. Crawford approached me directly. Eleanor, I've enjoyed our conversations tonight. I'm involved with a development project that could benefit from your expertise. Would you be open to a consultation meeting next week? The request, professional recognition from a significant business figure, represented exactly the kind of opportunity I had been missing during my years of self-diminishment. I'd be happy to discuss your project, I replied, exchanging business cards with him. My schedule is quite flexible next week. After the guests departed, the three of us moved around the penthouse in the comfortable rhythm of post-party cleanup. Victoria collecting wine glasses from side tables, James adjusting the thermostat and lighting, me organizing the remaining dessert items for storage. There was a different energy between us, more balanced, more respectful, as though the evening had crystallized the shifting dynamic that had been evolving since my revelation about the building's ownership. That went exceptionally well, Victoria observed as she placed the last of the crystal flutes in the dishwasher. The Crawfords were clearly impressed. You created a beautiful evening, I acknowledged sincerely. Your attention to detail was evident in everything from the menu to the floral arrangements. Victoria accepted the compliment with a nod, then added something unexpected. Your contributions made a significant difference, both the planning, suggestions, and your conversations with the guests. Crawford seemed particularly interested in your insights about commercial real estate trends. Yes, James agreed, joining us in the kitchen. In fact, I think he was more interested in your development experience than in my investment proposals. Rather than sounding resentful, James seemed genuinely pleased by this outcome, a marked departure from his previous tendency to minimize my professional accomplishments when they might outshine his own. He mentioned wanting to meet about a project next week, I confirmed. You should definitely pursue that, James encouraged. Crawford's influence in the development community is substantial. His endorsement opens doors. The simple recognition of my professional capacity and encouragement to pursue opportunities beyond family support represented significant progress in our relationship. 3 days ago, James would likely have expected me to prioritize household assistance over any external professional engagement. Now he was actively encouraging my reconnection with business networks. As we finished the cleanup and prepared to retire for the night, Victoria paused before heading to the master suite. Eleanor, how did your meeting with the brownstone owner go today? Will you be taking the property? The question contained genuine interest rather than the passive-aggressive undertone that might have colored such an inquiry earlier in the week. I appreciated the straightforward approach. Yes, I confirmed. We've agreed on terms, and I'll sign the lease on Monday. I could move in as early as next weekend. Victoria nodded thoughtfully. It's all happening rather quickly. Sometimes when the moment is right for change, things align naturally, I observed. The brownstone appeared just when I was ready for it. Will you need help with the move? James offered. I could arrange for professional movers and take the day off to oversee things. The offer was kindly meant, but I recognized in it echoes of our old dynamic. James assuming I would need his management of a process I was perfectly capable of handling myself. Rather than reacting with irritation, I responded with gentle clarity. Thank you, but I've already arranged everything. The movers are scheduled for Saturday, and I've hired a service to handle the packing. Your moral support is appreciated, but you needn't adjust your work schedule. James accepted this with good grace, apparently recognizing his own tendency to unnecessarily manage aspects of my life. Of course, you've always been exceptionally organized. As I prepared for bed in the guest room that would soon no longer be my space, I reflected on the evening with a growing sense of satisfaction. The momentum of change was building not just in my own choices and behaviors, but in how James and Victoria responded to my evolving presentation of self. Victoria's inclusion of my professional background when introducing me to guests. James's evident pride when discussing my business practices. Both of them engaging with me as an accomplished individual, rather than merely a supporting character, in their household drama. These were significant shifts that suggested the possibility of a healthier, more balanced family dynamic moving forward. The woman who prepared for sleep that night was considerably closer to the authentic Eleanor Reed than the one who had awakened in this same room just 4 days earlier. The gathering momentum of reclaiming my identity, establishing appropriate boundaries and receiving earned recognition felt both exhilarating and grounding, the natural consequence of aligning my external presentation with my internal truth. As I drifted toward sleep, I found myself looking forward rather than back, anticipating the brownstone's peaceful garden, considering potential collaboration with Mr. Crawford, planning reconnections with former business associates. The momentum was carrying me forward into a future that felt increasingly aligned with my authentic self. Eleanor Reed was not just finding her way back. She was creating a path forward. 1 week after the Crawford dinner, I stood in the center of my new, brownstone living room surrounded by partially unpacked boxes and furniture waiting to be arranged. The moving process had gone smoothly. Professional packers had efficiently boxed my belongings from the penthouse guest room, and by Saturday afternoon, everything had been transported to the brownstone without incident. James and Victoria had stopped by briefly to see the property, offering genuine compliments on its charm and character before leaving me to settle in. The sense of accomplishment was palpable as I arranged my books on the built-in shelves and hung my grandmother's landscape paintings on walls that were now unquestionably mine to decorate. This space represented more than just a change of address. It was the physical manifestation of my reclaimed independence, a tangible symbol of the transformation that had begun with that moment of clarity in the penthouse kitchen just 2 weeks earlier. Monday morning dawned clear and crisp, perfect autumn weather for my scheduled meeting with Richard Prescott, Victoria's father. The consultation he had requested following the Crawford dinner had evolved into a more formal discussion about potential collaboration on a mixed-use development near the university. I had reviewed his preliminary plans over the weekend, identifying several areas where my experience could add significant value to the project. I dressed with care in a tailored charcoal suit with burgundy accents, professional attire that reflected my authentic style rather than the deliberately muted wardrobe I had adopted during my years in the penthouse. The brownstone's location allowed for a pleasant walk to the downtown financial district where Richard's office was located, giving me time to organize my thoughts and enjoy the energizing autumn air. The receptionist at Prescott Holdings directed me to a conference room on the 32nd floor with expansive views of the city skyline. Richard was already there, reviewing documents with a younger man he introduced as his chief financial officer, Martin Kelly. "Eleanor, thank you for coming," Richard greeted me with professional warmth. I've been looking forward to discussing the University Gateway project with you. Your proposal has several interesting elements, I replied, setting my portfolio on the conference table. Particularly the integration of student housing with retail and academic spaces. For the next 30 minutes, our discussion focused exclusively on the project's design and financial projections. Richard seemed genuinely interested in my input, taking notes and asking pertinent questions about similar developments in my portfolio. The conversation flowed naturally, with mutual professional respect evident in our exchange. Then abruptly, Richard's demeanor shifted. He closed his portfolio and nodded to Martin, who gathered his materials and exited the conference room with a brief nod in my direction. "Eleanor," Richard said once we were alone, his tone markedly different. "While I appreciate your insights on the project, I must be frank about the real purpose of this meeting." The change in atmosphere was immediate and disconcerting. I maintained my professional composure, waiting for him to continue. "Victoria has informed me about your recent revelations regarding property ownership and your decision to move out of James and Victoria's home," he stated, his expression hardening. "These developments concern me deeply. I had anticipated this conversation might eventually occur, though not under the pretense of a business meeting." Richard had always been protective of Victoria's position and status, carefully cultivating her image in social and business circles. "My decision to establish my own residence again hardly seems cause for concern," I replied evenly. "It's a natural step at this point in all our lives." Richard leaned forward slightly, his posture becoming more assertive. "Let's dispense with the niceties, Eleanor. We both know what's happening here. After years of accepting a supportive role in my daughter's household, you've suddenly decided to assert yourself, flaunting your financial position, and disrupting the dynamic Victoria has carefully established." The characterization was so blatantly self-serving and divorced from reality that I might have laughed had the situation not been so serious. Instead, I responded with measured precision. "I've simply reclaimed my professional identity and established appropriate boundaries after years of diminishing myself to accommodate Victoria's preferences. Neither action constitutes flaunting or deliberate disruption." Richard's expression darkened. "Victoria has worked extremely hard to build her position in society and her interior design business. The sudden emergence of a mother-in-law with significant property holdings who was previously content to function as household support threatens to undermine her carefully cultivated image." The statement revealed so much about both Richard and Victoria's worldview that it momentarily left me speechless. The idea that my personal growth and self-respect could be framed as a threat to Victoria's social standing was as absurd as it was offensive. "I have no intention of undermining Victoria," I said finally. "My decisions are about my own well-being, not about challenging her position." "Intentions aside, the effect remains problematic," Richard countered. "Which brings me to the purpose of this meeting. I'm prepared to offer you a mutually beneficial arrangement." He reached into his briefcase and extracted a document folder, sliding it across the table toward me. "This contains a preliminary agreement for the purchase of Westfield Tower at a very generous price, 20% above current market valuation. The sale would be structured to minimize tax implications, and I would ensure you receive proper credit for its development in industry publications." I didn't touch the folder. "Westfield Tower isn't for sale." "Every property is for sale. At the right price," Richard insisted, "and this offer exceeds any reasonable valuation. The proceeds would allow you to travel, pursue other interests, perhaps relocate to a warmer climate, activities better suited to your stage of life than attempting to reassert yourself in business. Circles or complicate James and Victoria's social positioning." The condescension was breathtaking. The assumption that at 42 I should be seeking retirement rather than continued professional engagement. The implication that my presence in my son's life was problematic rather than valuable. the suggestion that my proper role was distant and peripheral rather than authentically engaged. "Richard," I said with remarkable calm considering my internal reaction, "let me be perfectly clear. Westfield Tower is not for sale, to you or anyone else. My business activities are not subject to Victoria's approval or convenience, and my relationship with my son is not negotiable." Richard's expression hardened further. "I had hoped you would be reasonable. Unfortunately, your response forces me to be more direct. Victoria has been extremely tolerant of your presence in their lives, Eleanor. That tolerance has limits." "Are you threatening to restrict my access to my son?" I asked, the implication becoming clear. "I'm simply conveying reality," Richard replied smoothly. "Family dynamics are complex. When individuals become difficult or disruptive, natural consequences follow. Victoria and James are building something important together, socially, professionally, eventually as parents. If your behavior threatens that foundation, they will protect themselves accordingly." The threat was unmistakable, despite its careful wording. Richard was suggesting that if I didn't retreat back into the diminished role Victoria preferred, I risked being excluded from my son's life entirely. It was manipulation of the highest order, targeting what he correctly identified as my greatest vulnerability, my relationship with James. "I believe our business discussion has concluded," I said, standing and gathering my portfolio. "Please convey to Victoria that while I understand her concern about changing dynamics, I trust her capacity to adapt to a healthier, more balanced relationship between us." Richard remained seated, his expression calculating. "Before you leave, there's one more thing you should consider, Eleanor. James's position at Hamilton Investment Group is quite prestigious for someone his age. The managing partners think very highly of him." The apparent non sequitur carried an obvious subtext. Richard had connections at James's firm, connections he was prepared to leverage against my son if I didn't cooperate with Victoria's preferred family narrative. "Are you implying you would interfere with James's career to punish me for asserting appropriate boundaries?" I asked, allowing my contempt for such tactics to show clearly in my voice. Richard shrugged slightly. "I'm merely observing that professional advancement often depends on complex factors beyond technical competence. Family stability, social connections, appropriate lifestyle choices all contribute to how promising executives are perceived. Disruption in any of these areas can have unfortunate consequences." The threat to James's career was the setback I hadn't anticipated, a calculated escalation designed to exploit my love for my son and concern for his well-being. It represented a significant obstacle to the progress I had made in reclaiming my authentic self and establishing healthier relationships. For a moment, familiar doubts surfaced. Was I being selfish in prioritizing my own identity and boundaries? Should I retreat back into the diminished role to protect James from potential career repercussions? Was the cost of my personal reclamation too high if it affected my son's professional standing? Richard clearly recognized my internal conflict. He pushed the folder toward me again. "Consider the offer, Eleanor. It represents the most painless resolution for everyone involved." I looked at the folder, then back at Richard, seeing him with complete clarity. This man had raised Victoria to believe her value lay in appearances and social positioning rather than authentic accomplishment or character. He had taught her that people were either assets to be utilized or obstacles to be removed. His worldview was fundamentally transactional, seeing even family relationships as negotiations to be won rather than connections to be nurtured. And in this moment of clarity, I found my answer. "No, Richard," I said with quiet conviction. "I will not consider the offer, nor will I be manipulated by threats to James's career. If you choose to interfere with his professional advancement to punish me, that reveals far more about your character than it does about my choices." I moved toward the door, then turned back for one final observation. "You've seriously miscalculated. If you believe James would respect or appreciate your intervention in his career, he values authentic achievement too highly to welcome advancement through manipulation rather than merit. Richard's expression remained impassive, but a slight tightening around his eyes suggested my words had found their mark. We'll see whose assessment of the situation proves correct, Eleanor. I hope for everyone's sake you reconsider your position. As I left Prescott Holdings and walked through the crisp autumn air toward my brownstone, I felt the full weight of the setback Richard's intervention represented. The progress I had made in reclaiming my identity and rebalancing my relationship with James and Victoria now faced a significant external threat, one deliberately targeted at my greatest vulnerability. The temptation to retreat, to surrender. This hard-won progress in exchange for James's professional security was powerful. It would be so easy to slip back into the diminished role, to once again become the invisible support system that demanded nothing and threatened no one's carefully constructed image. But as I approached my brownstone, with its promise of authentic space and independent identity, I recognized the fundamental trap in Richard's manipulation. Surrendering my legitimate boundaries and self-respect wouldn't actually protect James. It would merely teach him that manipulation works. That authentic identity should be sacrificed for appearance. That relationships are power struggles rather than connections based on mutual respect. What kind of mother would I be if I modeled such surrender? What message would it send about the value of authenticity, the importance of self-respect, the nature of healthy relationships? By the time I reached my front door, my resolve had strengthened rather than weakened. This setback, significant as it was, would not derail the essential work of reclaiming my authentic self and establishing healthier relationships. I would need to be strategic, careful, and determined in navigating the new complications Richard had introduced. But I would not abandon the journey I had begun. As I entered my new home, surrounded by boxes still waiting to be unpacked, and furniture not yet perfectly arranged, I felt a renewed commitment to creating both physical and emotional space that honored my true identity. The path forward had become more challenging, but the destination remained clear. A life of authenticity, dignity, and genuine connection rather than performance, diminishment, and manipulation. The significant setback had not broken my resolve. If anything, it had clarified exactly why this transformation was so necessary. Not just for me, but for the integrity of the relationships I valued most. Eleanor Reed would not be diminished again. The evening after my confrontation with Richard, I sat in my brownstone's reading nook watching darkness settle over the garden. A cup of tea cooled beside me, forgotten as I processed the day's events and their implications. Richard's threats had shaken me more than I wanted to admit, targeting the precise vulnerability that had kept me in a diminished role for the past 3 years, my fear of damaging my relationship with James. For so long, I had justified my gradual surrender of identity and dignity as necessary sacrifices to maintain my connection with my son. I had told myself that supporting his marriage meant accepting whatever role Victoria deemed appropriate for me, regardless of how little respect or recognition that role afforded. I had convinced myself that true maternal love required this kind of self-erasure. But Richard's calculated manipulation had forced me to confront the fundamental flaws in that reasoning. Had my accommodation actually created a healthier relationship with James? Had it fostered genuine connection based on mutual respect and recognition of each other's authentic selves? Or had it instead enabled increasingly unbalanced dynamics that diminished us both? The questions demanded honest reflection rather than reflexive responses. Setting aside my cold tea, I moved to the antique writing desk I had positioned near the front windows. From its drawer, I extracted a leather-bound journal I had purchased years ago but rarely used, a beautiful object that had seemed too precious for ordinary thoughts. Tonight, however, the work of internal reconciliation demanded proper tools. I opened the journal to its first blank page and began to write, not with careful composition, but with raw honesty, allowing thoughts and realizations to flow unfiltered onto the page. What am I truly afraid of losing with James? The question revealed deeper concerns than I had previously acknowledged. Beyond the day-to-day connection, beyond my place in his life's significant moments, what frightened me most was losing the essence of our relationship, the mutual recognition, the shared history, the understanding that transcended roles and circumstances. But had that essence been present in our recent relationship? Had James truly seen me, recognized my value beyond utility, honored my identity beyond my maternal role? Or had he, like Victoria, come to view me primarily through the lens of what I could provide rather than who I truly was? The painful truth emerged through my unsparing self-examination. Our relationship had already lost much of what I feared losing. My accommodation hadn't preserved authentic connection, but had instead replaced it with a hollow performance of family, closeness that served everyone's image but no one's heart. What kind of example have I set for James through my surrender? This question cut even deeper. As his mother, I had always hoped to model integrity, self-respect, healthy boundaries, and authentic self-expression. Yet for the past 3 years, I had demonstrated precisely the opposite, showing him that love meant self-erasure, that relationship required submission, that peace was worth any price, including dignity. What message had this sent about how he should view himself in relationships? About how he should treat others? About what constituted healthy connection versus unhealthy accommodation? If I truly loved my son, I needed to model healthier patterns, not through lectures or demands, but through living authentically myself. I needed to demonstrate that genuine love thrived through mutual respect and recognition, rather than dominance and submission. I needed to show that boundaries strengthened relationships rather than threatening them. What parts of myself have I abandoned that I most need to reclaim? This question shifted my reflection from relationship dynamics to personal identity. Beyond my professional accomplishments and financial independence, what essential qualities had I surrendered in my effort to fit Victoria's narrative of the proper mother-in-law? My directness, my quiet confidence, my capacity to occupy space unapologetically, my willingness to express dissent when necessary, my humor, often dry and occasionally pointed, my aesthetic preferences, bolder, more colorful, less conventionally feminine than Victoria's carefully curated style. None of these qualities had made me difficult or disruptive in any objective sense. They had simply made me distinctly myself, an individual presence rather than a convenient supporting character in someone else's story. What remains valuable from my years of accommodation? This question emerged unexpectedly, challenging the temptation to view the past 3 years as entirely negative. While I had surrendered too much of my authentic self, the experience had also developed certain qualities worth preserving: patience, deeper observation skills, increased empathy for others' insecurities and fears, greater awareness of how environments and interactions affected different personalities, the capacity to choose my battles wisely rather than engaging in pointless power struggles. These were not insignificant gifts, even if they had been acquired through difficult circumstances. The task now was not to abandon everything from this period, but to integrate these valuable qualities with my reclaimed authentic self. How do I navigate forward with integrity after Richard's threats? The final question addressed the immediate practical challenge. Richard had made it clear that Victoria, and by extension, potentially James, viewed my reclamation of identity as threatening to their carefully constructed narrative. They had demonstrated willingness to use manipulation and threats to maintain that narrative. How could I proceed without either surrendering my authentic self again or triggering the very damage to relationships I hoped to avoid? The answer that formed as I continued writing surprised me with its clarity and conviction. I would neither retreat into accommodation nor launch a counterattack. Instead, I would simply continue living authentically, making choices based on my values rather than others' expectations, establishing boundaries with calm consistency rather than defensive reactivity. I would not discuss Richard's threats with James unless circumstances made it necessary. Doing so preemptively might force James to take sides before he had fully processed the evolving dynamics between us, potentially damaging our relationship, rather than strengthening it. Instead, I would trust in the inherent power of authenticity, its capacity to inspire recognition and respect from those capable of genuine connection. I would trust in James's intelligence and perceptiveness, his ability to see manipulation for what it was if Richard actually attempted to interfere with his career. I would trust in the foundation I had built with my son long before Victoria entered our lives, a foundation of love, integrity, and mutual respect that remained beneath the distortions of recent years. This approach carried no guarantees. James might indeed choose Victoria's narrative over reconnecting with my authentic self. Richard might follow through on his threats, creating professional complications for James that strained our relationship. The path forward held genuine risks and uncertainties. But the alternative, retreating into self-erasure to maintain an illusion of connection, was no longer acceptable. It would betray not only myself, but also the values I most wanted to impart to my son. Sometimes the most loving choice involved standing firmly in one's truth, even when that truth created discomfort or conflict. As I closed the journal several hours later, I felt a profound sense of internal reconciliation. The disparate parts of myself, the successful businesswoman and the loving mother, the accommodating peacemaker and the boundary-establishing individual, the person I had been and the person I was becoming, were no longer in conflict. They had found integration in a more complex, more authentic wholeness. The brownstone's quiet enveloped me as I prepared for bed, so different from the constant subtle tensions of the penthouse. In this space that was entirely my own, I could fully embody this integrated self without negotiation or compromise. The physical environment both reflected and supported the internal reconciliation taking place. My phone chimed with a text message just as I was turning out the lights. It was from James. "Hope you're settling in well at the brownstone. Let me know when might be a good time for that dinner we discussed. Just the two of us." The message contained no hints of Richard's influence, no suggestion that our relationship had been compromised by the day's events. Whether this indicated Richard hadn't yet spoken to James, or simply that James was making his own determinations regardless of his father-in-law's manipulations remained to be seen, I responded with simple warmth. "The brownstone feels like home already. Dinner would be lovely. How about Wednesday evening? There's a wonderful neighborhood restaurant just around the corner I'd like to show you." His reply came quickly. "Wednesday works. Looking forward to it." As I finally settled into sleep, I recognized that the internal reconciliation I had achieved tonight represented not an endpoint, but a beginning. The integration of my authentic self with the lessons of the past 3 years was not a static achievement, but a dynamic foundation for whatever challenges and opportunities awaited. Richard's threats and Victoria's resistance would likely continue to create complications. The relationship with my son remained in transition, its future, shape still emerging through our evolving interactions. The professional reconnections I had begun to establish would require nurturing and development. But I faced these continuing challenges from a position of internal coherence rather than fragmentation. I no longer experienced my needs for authentic self-expression and meaningful connection as competing forces requiring agonizing choices. I had reconciled these seemingly contradictory aspects into a unified approach grounded in integrity, compassion, and self-respect. Eleanor Reed was not simply reclaiming a former identity or constructing an entirely new one. She was integrating all she had been, learned, lost and discovered into something more complex and authentic than had previously existed. The internal reconciliation achieved through honest self-reflection had created capacity for external challenges that might once have seemed overwhelming. Whatever came next, whether further resistance from Richard and Victoria, or gradual healing of family relationships, I would face it from this place of internal coherence. The reconciliation within created resilience for the journey ahead. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.